Thank you so much for being with us.
It's good to be here.
In your recent testimony in Congress, you argued that the United States does not have to provide additional security aid to Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and to be specific, what I said was we don't need to increase. I do think we need to continue the security cooperation that we have, but in terms of a threat that Central Asian states and Uzbekistan particularly could experience from Afghanistan post-2014, I think there's still room. I think the jury's still out on whether or not there's going to be some measure of success. And I think with all the agents of change that are in action in Afghanistan, I think it's too early to presume failure and that the threats are going to immediately spill over. In addition to that, I think the Central Asian states have very capable security forces, and I don't see a compelling need for increased security cooperation. I think we should continue the relationship as we have them.
And especially when the Obama administration is openly saying that they don't see any imminent threat of extremism in the region right now.
Yeah.
I mean, based
exactly.
on your analysis, how much of a militant threat do we have in the region that comes from Afghanistan or Pakistan?
Historically, there are militant groups that have proclaimed and stated and announced that they have intentions to, for example, topple President Karimov's regime, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, the Islamic Jihad Union. These militant groups exist. They do present a threat. They have conducted attacks in Central Asia, for example, in Tashkent in 2004. But I think in terms of what these groups are capable of, for example, from the Islamic Jihad Union, we haven't seen any major attacks since Tashkent in 2004, except for an operation in Germany in 2007. So it looks like these groups are only capable of conducting limited attacks every few years. They seem to be pretty stuck in the Afghanistan and Pakistan region, and I think that they'll be stuck there for a while. I think we could look at these groups as having decreased in numbers based on the ISAF and Afghan National Security Force operations in Afghanistan. They have affected those numbers, as well as the Pakistani military operations. Looking through all the different news reports and following the different reports on these organizations, I think we can say their numbers have decreased. I think probably the best estimate, based on all the reading I've done, is probably a couple hundred fighters for these two groups.
And they're concentrated around Waziristan, in that area?
Yes, I think that's, according to some of the analysts I've read, that seems to be the location, yeah.
How about the northern parts of Afghanistan? Because the Central Asian officials keep saying that militants are back on our doorsteps.
I think it's reasonable to say, in terms of what the fighting that we've seen in Afghanistan and that we've seen the militants there conduct operations in northern Afghanistan, I've seen the reports in the media that there are IMU in northern Afghanistan, but I think one of the things that will complicate that as to whether or not they're actually IMU or not,
or just their supporters,
is that you do have an Uzbek minority up there who could be part of the militants operating in Afghanistan. So it's hard to say if there's Uzbeks, are they IMU or are they simply Taliban supporters or sympathizers that are Afghan Uzbeks.
How much of a discussion is there within the U.S. military about Central Asia?
I think there's quite a bit in terms of, I know from past experience in my own career that we talked about Central Asia quite a bit. And I know today, especially Transportation Command and Central Command, they have the Northern Distribution Network through Central Asia. And in terms of coordinating that, looking out for that, the plans, I'm sure it's a topic of discussion in the military as well as in the interagency.
What we hear very often is that it's actually the Pentagon and the U.S. military that has most of the leverage when it comes to the region. Would you agree with that?
Actually not. I mean, it's always been one of those questions, how much role do unified commands have in policymaking? There's great books that journalists have put out on the topic, and it's been a discussion. But I think that the military and the unified commanders, generally, these four-star generals understand, and admirals, understand that they do have a potential that could play a very influential role, and I think a lot of them are very careful in terms of making sure that they're in line with the administration's policies, communication standards, and as well as working with the ambassadors in the region. So I would say that although the military does have an influence and that sometimes those are relationships that are more important to regional governments, that we do a very good job of making sure that the State Department is the lead for foreign policy, the President is directing what policies we have, and I think our unified commands probably stick close to that.
As you know, the U.S. intelligence community is now openly making it clear that, the sources of instability in Central Asia could really come from within, not necessarily from outside. Would you agree with that assessment?
Based on everything I've done, I mean, I've studied Central Asia for quite some time, and I know that in terms of what factors of instability that we look at, in fact, there's academic conferences going on right now to talk about what types of instability there are in Central Asia. And I do think that in terms of what can cause instability, as anywhere in the world, not just Central Asia, I think most instability probably comes from within, from the factors and the issues that are at play within those populations and in those systems of government, those economies. I think it's rare that we see instability actually spread from one country to another as if it's a geographical phenomenon. I think it's more based on the specific factors that are going on inside that country.
Well, there is a lot of debate here in Washington, but also in the region about how much should or could U.S. help in terms of security, in terms of counterterrorism. And even some of the harshest critics of the Central Asian governments, such as those in Uzbekistan, such as the Uzbek government, they say that, well, U.S. should really provide more security military aid because that in turn creates some kind of a leverage, that Washington could gain some leverage over the situation, over the policy-making process in this country. What do you think of that?
Navbahor, I think that's a great question because the way I look at it, in my own personal opinion, I think that the Uzbeks' request for additional security assistance and the concerns that they're advocating about Afghanistan post-2014 and after an ISAF withdrawal, I think these are legitimate questions to ask. And I can see where they might interpret that they have concerns about security, especially since there were groups that went to Afghanistan that their intent is to topple President Karimov's regime. So Uzbekistan should look to see, do these groups have the potential to come back and threaten Uzbekistan? But what concerns me more is that I'm not sure Uzbekistan has done everything that it could to deal with this threat. So it causes me to question, how seriously do they take it? And I think it is more a leverage to get specific military equipment from the U.S., and they know that this is a sensitive topic for the U.S., and I think that they can gain leverage over the United States in terms of if they ask for security assistance for counterterrorism purposes because of our concerns, that we'll be more likely to give it. And in terms of Uzbekistan and what they're doing about it, when countries have a fear or a concern, and I'll relate this back to the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had a fear about nuclear weapons and the prospect of nuclear war. And that caused both countries to consider actions that they might not normally have considered. And I think when you have concerns, you do things that maybe your prior policies or your statements would run counter to that. So for example, President Reagan and Gorbachev's meeting in Iceland to discuss arms limitations and reducing nuclear weapons. An unprecedented maneuver based on a potential fear of nuclear weapons. I think that if Uzbekistan was truly concerned about a threat emanating from Afghanistan, they should be open to considering changes in their policy. For example, its relationship with Tajikistan. And if it's truly concerned about the threat emanating from Afghanistan, it probably needs to prioritize fixing and resolving its relationship with Tajikistan and with its other neighbors and improving cooperation.
U.S. officials keep on telling us that whatever they give or whatever they're giving or they will ever give would be non-lethal. That, there is no conversation about any kind of a lethal equipment, weapons, arms. What is the difference between non-lethal and lethal when it comes to military equipment? I mean, you can debate about that, you know, forever too, right?
I think so, you can. I mean, our modern militaries are focused on improved communications, the ability to see at night, the ability to operate in better situational awareness of the units to your left and right. So in terms of whether or not something is lethal, I think almost any piece of equipment can be utilized to improve the capability or combat effectiveness of units. I think we probably just need to be more specific in terms of what we're saying and saying we're not considering the sale of weapons platforms. That might be a better terminology to say. And even that those types of issues present concerns for even the regional militaries. They have legacy arsenals that are based on a different type of equipment. Equipment needs to be interoperable. So it's very difficult to say. Buying certain weapons platforms from the United States may not work in their militaries. It couldn't fit it within the rest of the systems that they have.
Well, let's take unmanned aerial vehicles, like the ones that U.S. is giving to Uzbekistan now. That was one of the latest decisions.
Oh, are we?
Yeah, yes. And Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, you know, Republican from California, also recently confirmed about that in our interview. So what are these machines, for example? You know, unmanned aerial vehicles. They're not drones, from what we understand. They are smaller than drones, although they look like drones, but they are robotic equipment, right?
Yes. And there are many types of unmanned aerial vehicles. A monitoring, yeah, it has a intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability. So it's got a camera, basically. It flies around.
We also know that the Uzbek government has now been asking for helicopters, military helicopters. You know, our sources tell us that they want something like Black Hawks. They could be seen as lethal equipment too. They could be used for killing purposes, no?
It's possible. I mean, when we look at terrorists mount weapons in the back of a pickup truck. So I think can any platform necessarily be weaponized or utilized to kill people? Yeah, I mean, in that sense, yes. In a strict sense, though, I think the Black Hawk is normally considered a utility helicopter or a cargo helicopter. For example, our aerial ambulances in Afghanistan are Black Hawks. So it could be a medevac capability as well. So there's the primary use of the Black Hawk is for cargo, utility, personnel transport, and for example, like the medical evacuation. So not normally as a weapons platform.
What kind of conditions does military assistance come with?
Usually, and in fact, when we, in our security assistance programs that the militaries have, and I don't think they've changed since I was involved, when we negotiate a sale or the use of military equipment, there are conditions that are usually placed on that. Often, sometimes it is the ability for the United States to come back and inspect later to count the numbers of equipment to make sure that they haven't turned around to sold them to other countries, that they haven't attempted to reverse engineer the equipment, that they've maintained accountability of them. These are things that we consider important, is that if we've determined that they're going, you know, for example, if we were going to sell night vision devices to a border guard unit, we would reserve the right to come back at a later date, at a coordinated inspection time, to count, to make sure they were there, to make sure that they hadn't been sold for illegal purposes or anything like that. So those conditions are there. In terms of what other things come with it, sometimes they need additional training or maintenance services, spare parts agreements, different forms of technical cooperation to ensure that they understand what they're buying, understand what the issues or maintenance logistics concerns might be associated with that equipment.
What can U.S. do if Washington finds out that the weapon that they have given to a country is being misused? Is there a way to stop or to dismantle that equipment or to take it back? What kind of measures does Washington take? Do they ever take any measures?
That's a very interesting question, Navbahor. In fact, it makes me want to go research to see if we've ever attempted to do that. I know it's a very difficult circumstance when relationships break down. And I think I could look back and look at the situation with Iran. Iran, back in 1979, when the huge break in the hostage crisis and the break in relations. At the time, Iran had huge arsenal of American equipment. And the difficulty that they then found themselves in based on the broken relationship was they couldn't find spare parts. And so I think that's probably the consequence that a nation would face for breaking any agreement with the U.S. is that any future of gaining access to U.S. military equipment or things like that, they place it in jeopardy. So I think in a lot of cases, it almost cements a relationship, and countries don't tend to risk the U.S. relationship by violating such as it might seem a small thing to violate a security assistance agreement in terms of use of equipment. But I think they don't want to place the greater relationship in jeopardy. So I think for the most part, countries probably follow through on the conditions that the U.S. places. And I think we can probably place a pretty high confidence in that. Is it always true? I couldn't say. I think it's a very interesting question to take a look at.
Well, I guess then will it be safe to say that if Uzbeks are asking for more military equipment, they definitely know what they're doing? This is a commitment.
I would hope so. I mean, and I think that the nature of the U.S.-Uzbekistan relationship, even though it's had its ups and downs, I think there's a serious commitment on the part of both countries to want to ensure that we keep a good relationship. I'm sure it doesn't make the Uzbekistan government, I'm sure President Karimov doesn't like to hear different U.S. leaders come and criticize the human rights situation or the progress on reforms and economic freedoms and things like that. It can't be comfortable to hear those things. But to believe that your relationship with the United States is important enough that you're willing to abide the criticism, attempt to do things to implement reforms inside the country, I don't think the critics that are criticizing Uzbekistan are ever going to be completely happy with the progress or the rapidity of progress in Uzbekistan. So this is going to continue to be a contentious, controversial relationship, but I think we have good prospects for there being a strong relationship between Uzbekistan and the United States, especially if both sides are willing to continue to work at it. And I think I'm pleased that despite the low point in 2005, that the relationship seems to have improved since then. So I think this bodes well for the future.
So you're optimistic?
I would say I am optimistic. And I think even the critics have to recognize that presidents don't always stay in power their entire lifetime, and that eventually leadership changes. And I think that's one thing that Uzbekistan is going to be facing in the future is there's going to be a change in leadership. And I think Uzbeks as well are interested to know what kind of changes that will entail.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Navbahor. It was great to be here.